I'm just very curious to get your view on the role that age and this presidential race is going to play.
Age is absolutely a legitimate issue to talk about, and it's important to talk about it with both candidates. And I worry a little bit that those of us in the media talking so much about Joe Biden's age in particular, that we come to make it seem like the only issue in this election.
David, where does this podcast find you?
Washington, D.C.
You live in D.C.?
Yeah.
How long have you lived in D.C.?
Oh, my goodness. 15 years.
Oh, wow.
16 years.
I did not know that.
No one knows it because I'm a New Yorker and I work for a company that has New York in the name.
There you go. So let's start kind of meta. Distill down, if you can, what you believe is going on in the U.S. economy right now.
So there's a lot of discussion about how good is the U.S. economy? Are Americans irrational for being unhappy with the economy? And in a short-term sense, I think that's an important debate and a fair debate. And there are some ways in which people are maybe a little bit more pessimistic than the economic numbers warrant. But in the big picture, our economy has been disappointing for most Americans for much of the last half century. You can see that if you look at wage statistics. You can see that if you look at wealth or net worth statistics. You can see that if you look at all kinds of measures of social well-being, like the percent of kids who grow up with two parents, the percent of people who spend time behind bars at some point in their life, the percent of people who suffer chronic pain. You can see it in the polls, how Americans feel, not just in this current moment, but about the country's direction. And then in some ways, to me, the single most important and most alarming statistic is that in the 1960s and 70s, and even into the early 1980s, the United States had a normal life expectancy for a rich country. And for the last 15 years or so, we have had the lowest life expectancy of any rich country, lower than Canada, lower than any country in Western Europe, lower than Japan or South Korea or Australia. And so I think in a really basic way, our economy and our society isn't working for huge numbers of people, particularly people who don't have four-year college degrees.
So I'm reminded of the William Gibson quote that the future is here, it's just not evenly distributed. I think that's a decent way to describe the economy, that prosperity or unprecedented prosperity is here, it's just not evenly distributed. Would you agree with that?
Yes. The only thing I would add is if you're not receiving the distribution, it's less important that in some theoretical sense unprecedented prosperity is here. But I absolutely agree with you that given the bounty that our economy produces, we could have an economy that works really well for huge numbers of people. The fact that we don't is not a small detail or a footnote, not that you're suggesting it is, but in some ways it's the main story.
Well, it's outrageous. I mean, NVIDIA is now worth almost as much as the German stock market, but 1 in 5 households have food insecurity. I mean, it's just it only makes your point that much more stark, right?
Yeah.
So I'll put forward a thesis and you respond to it, that we are moving to a Hunger Games economy where the number of billionaires in the last 10 years has quintupled. And because Americans are such optimists, we believe that our kid is going to be the billionaire. So we don't, and also the incumbents, corporations, and the wealthy are very sophisticated in terms of getting overrepresented in Washington, D.C. And we've just seen a massive crowding effect of the spoils into the top 1%. Am I oversimplifying it?
No, I think that's right. We have seen that. And although the 1% is a useful cutoff, we've seen even more of a crowding to the top 0.1 or 0.01. And we've seen some crowding to the top 10%. Right. And so we really have seen a huge increase in inequality. One of the things this is a book of history. It's a book of stories, much more so than a book of economics or numbers. And I end up with a core criticism of both the political right and the political left in our country. And they are two very different criticisms. I think the political right, about 50 years ago, Ronald Reagan being the key figure, offered this prescription for what ailed our economy in the 1970s. And it wasn't a crazy prescription. Our economy really was struggling in the 70s. And Reagan and the people around him came along and they said, look, if we cut taxes, particularly for rich people, and we shrink labor unions, guidelines and we shrink regulation and we let companies get really big and we move toward this neoliberal economy, it'll be better for everyone. And it hasn't been. I mean, you and I just went through the statistics, whether it's on income or wealth or life expectancy. This economy really for decades hasn't been working very well for huge numbers of Americans. And we see parts of the Republican Party start to question that laissez-faire model. But for the most part, the dominant economic policy of the Republican Party is still this economic policy that really hasn't worked that well for most people. And then on the left, we have a lot of Democrats who say, why is it that these working class people are so irrational that they won't come and support our party because we believe in different economic ideas? And that is true, but it's also true that the Democratic Party has increasingly become a party of college graduates and relatively affluent professionals and has adopted a whole set of policies on other issues, immigration arguably the number one right now in the debate, that really are alienating to huge numbers of working class people. And for a while, Democrats said, well, that's because those people are ignorant and they're hateful and they're racist. I think that was obviously racism plays a big role in American politics, but I think it was wrong to suggest it was all that in 5 or 10 years ago. And it's clearly wrong now because we have seen substantial numbers of voters of color move away from the Democratic Party in the last 5 years. Mostly working class voters who look at the Democratic Party and say, that's not a party I want to be a part of. And when you put these two things together, neither of our parties reflects the interests and the values of working class people and is out there trying to create an economy that works better for them.
So let's start there. An economy that works better for more people. What do you think are some of the building blocks of restoring or greater distribution of this immense prosperity?
I think labor unions are really important. And I'm a bit self-critical on that. I've been writing about the economy at the New York Times for most of the last 25 years, and I don't think I've paid enough attention to labor unions. Now, labor unions are not perfect. I have been in a labor union and at times been frustrated.
Me too.
I manage people in labor unions, in a labor union. I understand that labor unions can sometimes be an impediment to important change. But when you look at the history and the research, the dominant experience is that labor unions lift the wages of workers and they don't cause companies to go out of business. They instead basically redistribute money that would go to top executives and to shareholders and instead increase the wages of workers. And yes, labor unions are flawed, but so are corporations. And when you don't have flawed labor unions checking the power of flawed corporations, you end up with the kind of highly unequal economy that we had in the 1920s and that we have had for the last few decades.
So I want to unpack that, and I'm generally open to learning here. I think the intention, the stated goals, kind of the gestalt of unions and labor are positives. My issue is that 46 of the 47 countries that have unions have seen their membership decline dramatically. Union membership here has been cut in half. The bottom line is, by most metrics, America just doesn't buy into unions. And unless you can have a union that represents a majority of workers in an industry in a large region, you have a race to the bottom. And that is states that are anti-union end up attracting more business, and there's a lower tax base and fewer jobs for those union towns. And let me propose a solution. There should be one union, and it should be the federal government. And we should raise minimum wage to $25 a share, maybe some exceptions for exceptionally low income or low cost of living regions. All the admirable aims, they don't work as a construct.
I'm a little more optimistic for a few reasons. One, if you look at polling, huge numbers of Americans say they would like to be part of a labor union. Labor unions have higher approval now in polling than they've had in decades. It's true that many of them struggle to join unions. But the fact that there aren't unions isn't on its face evidence that there couldn't be. There also weren't labor unions in the 19-teens and 20s. And then government policy changed and the share of workers in unions changed. And then to your point about this sort of race to the bottom, we've had an interesting change in our economy that most people recognize, but they don't necessarily recognize why it can lead to a larger share of organized labor. Our economy is increasingly a service economy right? It's less a manufacturing economy it used to be, and it's more a service economy. That's not going to change. So if your fear is that, hey, if that factory unionizes in Pennsylvania or Michigan, a rival company or that company can just move to a non-union state like Alabama, or can move to a much lower wage country like in Latin America or, say, Vietnam, and then just make the same product and undercut the union wages. So even if you have that concern, think about just how much of our economy now that doesn't apply to. So your local Starbucks can't move to another state or another country and still be your local Starbucks. Your local hospital can't move to another state or another country and still be your local hospital. The Amazon warehouse that serves your community can't move to another state or another country and still be your local warehouse. And so in a service economy, it is much harder for companies to simply get around unions by leaving the area. And if we had different federal policy, I actually think that a service economy makes it possible to have a meaningfully larger share of workers represented by unions and able to take advantage of collective bargaining than we now do.
I think that's a compelling argument. Wouldn't it be more efficient to just take minimum wage, if minimum wage had kept up with productivity? I mean, here's what we've had. The last 40 years, we've had unbelievable gains in productivity. Workers haven't shared in it. Their wages have gone flat, productivity is up and to the right, and the gap between the two is literally trillions of dollars in stakeholder value that is accreted to shareholders and the top 1, if not the top 0.1%. So the question is, how do we shove more money into the lower 99, quite frankly? And it'd be good for the economy. They spend the money. You know, the 1% invests, which brings interest rates and cost of capital down. And you could argue they're more efficient. They do crazy things like build rockets and endow new wings at universities with their names on it. There's some good to that, but it's not as good as putting more money in the pockets of middle class and lower income people because they spend it all. It's sort of stimulus, right? The multiplier effect is greater. So if that's the goal, and we all agree that that makes sense, wouldn't it be more efficient to just have, again, $23 or $25 an hour minimum wage, or some sort of negative income tax where everyone makes $10,000 no matter what, and if you make zero, you get a tax rebate of $10,000. And if you make, and you figure out some sort of sliding scale that gives people the motivation to work, but have it be for, you have a social security number, you're in a union, right? Technically, wouldn't that be a more efficient way than trying to, because you talked about Starbucks. I'll use that as an example. 300 Starbucks have unionized, have voted to unionize is my understanding, but not one has come to a collective bargaining agreement. And so for all the talk about this great resurgence of unions, it's not having any much impact as far as I can tell on the ground level.
I agree. But I think we would need changes in federal law, basically, so that what happens now is a Starbucks store unionizes and Starbucks basically refuses to negotiate with them. They somehow find violations by the people who helped organize the union, and they let them go. But federal law could change and could basically say, look, when workers unionize, companies really have to recognize them and work with them. So the fact that hasn't happened so far, to me, it could still happen. We do need changes in federal law for it to happen. On your point about minimum wage, look, I think a higher minimum wage would have tons of benefits, but it is a minimum wage. It isn't going to have that much of an effect on middle class people. And so we can raise the floor, but I don't see how a minimum wage or a higher earned income tax credit can help working class and middle class people nearly as much as labor unions do. Because what we're talking about now are someone who right now might be, earning $40 an hour, but actually because of their productivity should be earning $50 an hour. That isn't something that a minimum wage is going to address. A minimum wage and EITC are really good for helping lower income people, and we should help lower income people. They're less good at helping working class and middle class people.
Mm-hmm. So labor or renewed strength or maybe laws that make it easier to unionize, that's one solution. Talk about some other solutions or recommendations.
I think investment is enormously important. Investment defined really broadly. So private sector investment, as you just noted, is really important. We need companies investing in things that are going to help in the long term. But there are a whole set of things that the private sector on its own doesn't tend to invest enough in. The private sector doesn't tend to invest enough in basic research and development because it's impossible to know how to profit from that in the moment, right? There's a reason that the federal government built the internet. There's a reason that the federal government essentially financed the entire early computer industry in this country. Because at the very beginning, it was hard to know exactly who would profit from it. And not only that, but IBM was a big maker of punch cards. And so initially, IBM said, well, we don't need a computer. We have this profitable business in punch cards. And so when the government doesn't invest enough, you tend to end up with a society that doesn't have enough basic R&D. It doesn't tend to have enough transportation infrastructure. And really crucially, it doesn't tend to have enough of an educated population. So if you're over 65 in the United States, you're part of the most educated generation in the world. There is no other country where people over age 65 are more educated than Americans are. If you're younger, you are not part of the most educated generation in the world. And so to me, a whole set of policies where we decide we're going to spend money today to make life better tomorrow is another really important part of creating an economy that is more prosperous for most people than our current economy is.
We'll be right back. Talk to us about what are your views on immigration? And I'd be curious if you could tie it back. It strikes me that it's going to probably be either the number one or the number two issue in the campaign. But give us your view of the atmospherics around immigration and what the right and the left are getting wrong, and what you think, how you think it's going to play out in the election.
The chapter in my book on immigration is the one that I was most uncertain, and if I'm being honest, nervous about what the response would be. And I actually think it's been the one where the feedback I've gotten has been the best, which makes me feel really happy because it also might be the chapter that I learned the most while researching and writing. There's probably a relationship between those two things. And so I spent a ton of time in the archives retracing the history of the 1965 law that has really created our modern immigration system. And that law has one really heroic piece of its legacy and one much less heroic piece of its legacy. The heroic piece of its legacy was that starting in the 1920s, our country basically said, we will only take immigrants from Western Europe. The one other exception was at the time there were no limits on immigration from Latin America, which may seem shocking today, but at the time there just weren't that many people coming from Latin America. So our country basically said, we won't take people from Eastern Europe, we won't take them from Southern Europe, we won't take them from Africa, we won't take them from Asia. Obviously a racist policy, right? It was just taking them from white countries. And the 1965 law got rid of that old system, and they said, we will treat all people who want to immigrate to our country equally. At the same time, the advocates for that 1965 law promised repeatedly. We're talking about LBJ, Ted Kennedy, who managed the bill in the Senate, Republicans and Democrats who pushed the law. Repeatedly, they promised, we are only changing who can come in. We are not changing how many people come in. They promised Americans again and again and again, we are not meaningfully increasing the level of immigration. If they hadn't done that, the bill couldn't have passed. Americans did not favor a huge increase in immigration. And yet, for technical reasons that I won't bore your listeners with, the bill did, in fact, lead almost immediately to an enormous increase in immigration, mostly involving exceptions with family members who didn't count toward the cap. But basically, what happened in the 1960s was we vastly opened our immigration system, and Congress and the president sold it to the American people under false pretenses. And I'm not saying that all of our immigration policy and all of the toxicity of the debate around it stems from that one decision. But for people who tend to be in favor of much higher levels of immigration, of very high levels of immigration, which I would say are basically two groups of Americans, kind of business-friendly Republicans who see it as a way to increase the workforce and probably hold down wages, and then progressives who believe in high levels of immigration from sort of a social justice standpoint. For people who believe in higher levels of immigration, it's worth grappling with the fact that the history of this is not a simple history in which the people who were in favor of more immigration were on the side of light and truth, and the people who were worried about it were not. And I think that we have lost this tradition that we had for a very long time in our country, in which there were progressives who worried about the effects that immigration would have on recent immigrants and on lower income native-born Americans. Historically, civil rights leaders and labor leaders and progressives were not in favor of huge levels of immigration in this country, and we've sort of lost that. And to me, it's really an important part of why so many working class people across races look at the Democratic Party today and say, oof, I'm not completely comfortable with that party. And on the flip side, the Republican Party just engages in this really, really stark and nasty xenophobia on immigration. And we've sort of missed this middle ground where we have people saying, look, we should welcome immigrants. We are a nation of immigrants, but we also need borders and we need border security. And everybody who wants to come to this country because it's a richer country than most countries can't simply come because they want to. And I think that kind of summarizes where we've ended up on immigration and frankly, why it's become such a huge problem for Joe Biden.
And what it strikes me as such a political hot potato when you think about an approach to immigration. Who would you point to, or what policy would you point to that you think is as a way forward?
A figure who I talk a lot about in the book is Barbara Jordan, the former congresswoman, late congresswoman from Texas, one of the first post-Reconstruction Black Americans to represent the South in Congress. She became famous during Watergate. And she, if you read some of her historical positions on this, she said, look, we need to be pro-immigrant, but that doesn't always mean being pro-immigration. We need to reject the xenophobia and racism that often greets immigrants, but that doesn't mean that we should have an open border. I think that is the position that, first of all, tends to reflect what most Americans believe and also has very strong economic arguments behind it. And today, I think where you tend to see that a lot is you tend to see it from Democrats who are mayors and governors and who've actually had to grapple with some of the really costly and chaotic influxes that we've had over the last couple of years, but also reject some of the race baiting that many Republicans use.
So, David, you have your finger on the pulse. I just want to, as we wrap up here, I'm just very curious to get your view on the role that age and this presidential race is going to play.
I mean, one of the hardest questions right now, right? Here's one way that I think about the overall frame. Age is absolutely a legitimate issue to talk about, and it's important to talk about it with both candidates. It's also important to acknowledge that there are several ways in which Donald Trump seems more energetic and presents as less old than Biden. There are other ways in which, Trump says a whole bunch of things that don't make any sense and forgets things. And there are other ways in which Trump's aging seems to be at least as much of a problem as Biden's does. At the same time, as a journalist, I'm a little bit haunted by a Gallup poll that came out after the 2016 campaign that asked Americans what they'd heard about each candidate. And the number one thing that most Americans reported hearing about Hillary Clinton was about her emails. I think Hillary Clinton's emails were a legitimate story. Surely they were not the most important thing about Hillary Clinton in 2016. And I worry a little bit that those of us in the media are at some risk of repeating that and talking so much about Joe Biden's age in particular that we come to make it seem like the only issue in this election. Joe Biden's performance as president suggests he absolutely can do this job. And so we're not dealing with someone who appears to be incompetent as president, whether you agree or disagree with his policies. Just look how much legislation he's gotten passed. More than I expected, quite frankly. Much of it bipartisan. I don't have a kind of nice pat answer here, Scott, but I'm just trying to get at the fact that on the one hand, it's a legitimate issue. And on the other hand, I think sometimes the media, those of us in the media, have a tendency to take a legitimate issue and make it seem like the only issue. And I think we'd be making a big mistake if we did that with Joe Biden's age.
David Leonhardt is a senior writer at the New York Times, where he writes The Morning, the Times' flagship daily newsletter. He's also been the newspaper's Washington bureau chief, an op-ed columnist, a staff writer for the New York Times Magazine, and the founding editor of The Upshot. He won a Pulitzer Prize for commentary in 2011. David's also the author of Ours Was the Shining Future, the story of the American dream, which The Atlantic and the Financial Times called one of the best books of 2023. He joins us from his home in our nation's capital. David, really appreciate your time.
Scott, thank you so much for this good conversation.